Okay, I feel like I'm gonna clickbait the title of this video, so I just want to say that it's probably wrong. If I wrote like something about hating these authors, I don't actually hate these authors, except Dave Eggers a little bit. Everybody else, it's just like the thing that I read from them wasn't quite my taste. They're not horrible people or anything like that, but I thought it would be fun to kind of explore other works from authors that I really didn't like the first time. I think one of these choices is really controversial, and I feel like I'm going to get a lot of hate for it, and I'm going to start with that. I read On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong, and I really didn't like it. I thought that it was so overly poetic, so flowery. I thought Ocean Vuong's a poet. He is not a prose writer, and it meant that a lot of the sentences were like so ridiculously poetic they were almost meaningless. Like, I was tired reading that book. I liked the story and it did make me feel very emotional, but like the writing, it just should have been poetry. You're a poet. So I've grabbed a poetry book by Ocean Vuong, which I think I'm gonna like better. His novel has a lot of merit. I love the idea of like writing letters to a mother who's illiterate. It's just like, you're not a prose writer, and I could not handle that. Then I have Swamplandia by Karen Russell. I read Orange World by Karen Russell, and that was the book of these authors that I disliked the least. I thought it was okay. I just thought that the short stories in it were very long and quite boring. I just didn't really care for any of them. So I have Swamplandia, which is not short stories. This is like a full novel of hers. I don't know what happens in it. I think this is more magical realism and very like imaginative, almost fantasy. Then I have Cursed Bread by Sophie Mackintosh. I read her book that says right here, Booker Prize long-listed author of The Water Cure. I read The Water Cure. I hated it. I thought it was so fucking stupid. I'm so against that book. That book makes itself out. It says it's like a feminist revenge story, and it's literally just a book about women getting taken advantage of over and over and over and over again. And then like hardly even, there's like no revenge. I thought it was stupid. I thought it was ridiculous that anyone would ever call that feminist. And it irritated me endlessly, and it also made me feel gross. So this book does not make itself out to be a feminist piece of literature, which is good, because I don't think Sophie Mackintosh is good at writing that. I think that was so stupid that they tried to sell it as that. This is about a couple who move into a town, and they're charismatic and mysterious, I think. Strange things are happening in the town. 6 horses are found dead. Widows see their lost husbands walking up the river in the night, coming back to claim them. Who really knows? I think this is just another kind of weird book, and I hope it's better than the first one. Then we have Dave Eggers, and you know what? It's a popular opinion to hate Dave Eggers. I read A Heartbreaking Work of Staggering Genius because that used to be my mom's favorite book. There's a lot of parallels with her life, and I think I would not have finished it if I hadn't known it was something that my mom really likes. What I thought was that Dave Eggers is a very compelling author, and I wouldn't want to go near him with a 10-foot pole. He is a self-absorbed, self-important prick, and I hated him. He's an egomaniac. I just think he thinks so fucking highly of himself, and he just seems like a total asshole. So Heartbreaking Work of Staggering Genius was his like autobiography. This is not about Dave Eggers, but also I disliked him enough that I did pick his absolute shortest book to read because I felt like I just couldn't handle more of him. There's merit in his writing, but him as a person, get the fuck away from me, Dave Eggers. You know what I mean? Okay, then I have the author of the worst book that I've ever read, which was Fantastic Land by Mike Bockoven. This is his other book, Killing It, which I think is honestly going to be just as bad. I think Mike Bockoven writes really fucking corny books, and I can't imagine this will be any different. I mean, look at the cover. This is a horror book. I think about stand-up comedians being murdered by a ghost, and it's called Killing It. What was I thinking? Obviously I'm gonna hate this too. Fantastic Land was a book about a bunch of high school students trapped at it's so stupid. Why did I read it? I'm embarrassed that I ever picked it up. It's about a bunch of high school students, and they're trapped at an amusement park after a hurricane has like separated the amusement park from the rest of the country, and it very quickly, like ridiculously quickly, devolves into like violence, and these groups split off and they're just like murdering each other. It's so gory, it almost felt like the author's poorly disguised fetish. Like, genuinely, it did not need to be that gory. And it wasn't even like, I wasn't even like, ew, this is disgusting. I was like tired of it. I thought it was so stupid. It also has this interview format where it's like told through interviewing people related to the park and then people who were at the park. And I thought he's not a good enough writer to pull that off because he could not differentiate the voices. And I think he knew he couldn't differentiate the voices. So he put these like quirks into everybody that made it even more obvious how similar every single voice was, because it would be like the exact same voice and then the person would use like one word slightly differently. It's hard to explain. It's the worst book ever. It's horror. It's absolutely horrid. There's nothing good about Fantastic Land. Is there going to be anything good about this? I really doubt it. I really, really highly doubt it. This will be stupid. There's no way this will be any different than Fantastic Land. It might be a little bit better. Can I promise you I'm going to read this one? No, because the whole point is seeing if the authors that I judged off of one work, if I can like maintain that judgment through their other works, and I already know the answer is yes for this. But these ones, I'm not so sure. I think honestly, I should have picked a higher rated Dave Eggers book. He's prolific. He's written 1,000 fucking things. I just didn't want to read, like all of his books are like 500-600 pages and I just did not want to commit to that. I don't care enough about this to do that. So I'm reading his shortest book ever. I'll see you when I've read something. I finished the poetry collection Time as a Mother by Ocean Vuong. I thought that I should start with this because I felt like I needed to give it the time it deserved. And if I ended with the poetry collection, I was just going to rip through it as fast as I could so that I could record the end of the video. But I still think I had a hard time getting into this, and I'm not sure if that's my problem or the book's problem. Reading this, I realized I don't know if I really like modern poetry. I think my years for poetry are like 1995 to 2010, and this was just like a little bit too recent. And I don't know, is that a reasonable complaint to have? To be clear, I don't read a lot of poetry. The poetry I read is often studying for school, and I don't love those really, really old poems, but I think I like really, really new poems even less. I'm like a Richard Siken fan. I like Mary Oliver. Sometimes I like poems that I see on Tumblr. I'm not gonna lie, the First Dog in Space poem, that's the best poem that's ever been written ever, and that's purely a Tumblr poem. I'm not really suited to complain about this or to critique this because I don't know anything. Clearly. This collection is really rooted in Vuong's identity as a queer Vietnamese immigrant, and I think that he has a lot of insightful things to say about that, but most of these poems didn't feel like they had all that much depth, and I think as a whole, it was not super coherent. It kind of felt like a random assortment, though you can tell that this is about the loss of his mother to cancer. It felt like some of these had a theme and made sense as a collection, and then some of them were just like random filler. It does feel really weird to say about such a deeply personal and intimate collection that it didn't feel like most of the poems had very much depth. I feel like I'm an asshole, but I did think that. The standout poem for me in here was on page 52, Amazon History of a Former Nail Salon Worker, which tells the story of his mother's death from cancer through her Amazon purchases over the course of a year or two, I think. I thought it was so simple, but also so innovative, and I felt like it captured such deep emotions through like really nothing, just like lists of Amazon products. This poem more than any showed Vuong's skill. I do think that he is a skilled writer. He's just not for me. Ironically enough, I liked the poems in here more that had more of a narrative, which I was not expecting because I did not like his prose. I thought his prose was way too poetic, and reading his prose, I was like, you're probably a really good poet. But then reading his poems, I was like, I want the narrative. I like the narrative better. Maybe that's just personal preference. I have not read very many poetry collections, so what can I really say? I really do think that Vuong's writing has merit and skill. I just don't think that it is for me. I think that I can really feel his like poetness. You know how poets are like kind of sometimes like a little bit like pompous and cringe? I feel like that just often really stands out to me, and maybe that's because of how modern it is. Like there are some lines in here that are just cringe. You know, like poets often think really highly of themselves, and I think that you can feel that, especially when they're saying things that just like are not going to age well, but they're saying it with this full earnestness and belief and confidence in themselves. Maybe that's mean. Okay, like for one, there's a character named Jackson, spelled Jaxson. That doesn't belong in any poem. That does not belong in any poem. Also this line, oh no, the sadness is intensifying. How rude. Get a grip. I'm not giving you good examples. There are great lines, standout lines in here. There's one standout poem in here. Most of them are just okay, and I'm sorry to say that. I'm still committed to seeing what everybody else sees in him, so I think that I will read his debut poetry collection, Night Sky with Exit Wounds, which, looking into it more, I'm pretty sure I should have read instead of this. I think that it's a lot more well-liked than this. There are a lot of people out there with similar complaints to me about like the coherence of the poems in here and also the lack of depth. I think Night Sky with Exit Wounds is far more highly regarded. And I'm just committed. I want to know what everybody sees in him. The next book I'm reading is Cursed Bread by Sophie Mackintosh, and I feel heartbroken to say that I've got a spoiler. I flipped to the back to see how many pages were in it so I could choose the right edition on Storygraph and track how I was reading, how much I was reading, how fast I was reading. And I saw author's note, and I was like, oh, I can read an author's note. It's not going to spoil it for me. Absolutely spoiled the whole book. Maybe I'm not going to get into like the entire plot of this book. I'll probably give you just like a little glimpse of the plot, maybe no spoilers this video, and then I'll like tell you what I think about it. I like making long videos where I tell you every single thing that happens in a book. My computer's going to explode. It actually cannot handle doing that anymore, and when I make long videos, I have to cut. Okay, first of all, I use iMovie, which is like genuinely so embarrassing. Don't talk to me. When I make videos, I have to cut these videos up into little 10-minute segments. The last video I made was an hour and 16 minutes. Do you know how many fucking video files I had to export to create that video in the end? It's too much. So I'm going to give a shot at making shorter videos. So I'll tell you more about this when I know what's happening. Okay, so I know like 1 second ago I said that I wasn't going to talk about what happens in this book and I was not going to spoil it and it was going to be a shorter video, and I've completely changed my mind on that. I like talking about everything, and I'm going to tell you everything that happens in Cursed Bread, which I finished yesterday. So the really quick summary of this is about a woman in a dying marriage who becomes obsessed with the new couple who move into her town. This is told half epistolary, and the letters hint at what's going to be the climax of the novel. The letters are from the present, and the narrative is in the past. Now I'm going to get into everything else, and I just want to say that if you are interested in this book, I think you should go into it somewhat blind, and I think you should be really careful what summaries you read. The summary on the back of this is fine to read. The summary on Storygraph spoils fucking everything. And it also calls it feminist, which I'll complain about later. I think the summary on Goodreads also spoils everything. Don't read those if you're interested in this book. And don't listen to what I'm about to say. Okay? Elodie is the narrator, and she's the baker's wife, and she's sort of a pillar in her 1950s small-town French community. And then Violet and her husband move into town, and Elodie becomes obsessed with both of them. She's obsessed with Violet in the sort of way where it's like, is she in love with her? Does she just want to be her? And the answer is both. After Violet and her husband arrive in this town, some weird stuff starts happening, but it's not really like a huge part of the novel, and it doesn't seem like it's connected to the two of them. I think it's kind of just setting the tone. A bunch of horses die and are laid out like as if a sacrifice has happened. There's a festival and some kids from out of town come, and they're jumping over the fire when one of them just jumps straight into the heart of the biggest fire. Meanwhile, Elodie is kind of making her way into Violet's life, or more so that Violet is allowing Elodie into her life. And as they become closer and closer friends, Elodie, who is obsessed with Violet, is kind of snooping around her life. Elodie has heard multiple conversations between Violet and her husband that she should not have heard, and she knows that Violet's husband is kind of force-feeding her this weird medication. There's a strange moment one of the first times Elodie comes over where the husband goes to get them wine, and when he brings it back, Violet reaches for one and he goes, "No, that's Elodie's, this one is yours." Elodie has also overheard Violet's husband tell her that she's not allowed to eat any of the bread, and Violet never does eat the bread. Elodie's the baker's wife, and she works at the bakery, so she's always around bread, always bringing bread over to Violet's place, and Violet just tears it into pieces. She never takes a bite. While Elodie is becoming closer with Violet, she's also moving farther away from her husband, who has been very distant from her, won't touch her, and won't interact with her unless they're like out in public, and she's moving closer to Violet's husband, who is developing this relationship with her. We know Violet's husband to be a controlling and manipulative and charismatic man, and he is that with Violet, and he also is that with Elodie. Like, he comes into the bakery one time and he says, "Touch yourself," and just like makes her do it behind the counter, but she's into him, so it's like kind of consensual. It's really strange. At one point, Violet's husband says, "Let's meet up, like let's go to a hotel," and Elodie goes there and he never shows up. So she goes to Violet seeking comfort, but also having just intended on having an affair with her husband. Violet comforts her a bit, and then she says, "Oh, you really went, didn't you?" And we learn that Violet has been orchestrating this whole thing with her husband. They've been playing with her. Violet also tells her that Elodie's husband has impregnated this young woman in town who's been walking around pregnant forever and is like cheating on her. Elodie's devastated and she loses it, but when she goes back home, I think to confront her husband, he's lying in bed incredibly ill. And everyone suddenly becomes very, very ill. They're physically sick, but they're also hallucinating. Literally every person in this town, except Violet and her husband, is like on their fucking deathbed because Violet's husband has poisoned the bread. He has given Elodie's husband this little elixir that he said is like something they use in America to make their bread white. And it's poisoned the entire town. Most of the townsfolk die, and the ones who don't are sent to an asylum because they've literally gone mad. Violet and her husband escape, and Violet is blamed for this crime. The police say that there's no evidence of her husband ever, like, coming to live with her. He obviously exists. I think he's just lying about who he is. He's called the ambassador the whole time. He's not an ambassador, and the police find this out after it all happens, but the entire blame gets placed on Violet. Elodie is one of the people who goes mad, but she ends up recovering, and that's where the letters are coming from, is Elodie living a different life after her entire community has been wiped out by this bread poisoning. Elodie is writing these letters to Violet. She is so obsessed with Violet in such a fun way. I love books about women who are obsessed with other women. I love when the sexuality is blurred and unclear, and I love when women do just like weird fucking things because of their obsession. Like, she's like stealing lipsticks and like eating earrings and stuff. It's awesome. This is like such a wildly horny book, but not really in an erotic way, more in like an obsession way, and this like strange intimacy that's not overly sexual but is so horny. I think this book, I found it hard to understand the motivations of the characters. We only ever hear from Elodie, both in like the first person narrative and in the letters that she's writing to Violet, and I thought that everyone was really weird and absurd, and I didn't know why they were doing the things they were doing, and it was kind of just confusing, but I also in some ways liked the absurdity of it. I think this book suffered a little bit with some pacing issues. It was quite boring in the beginning, and then it really picked up at the end. I just wish that there was like a few more things to keep me hooked in the first like 2/3 of the book. Compared to The Water Cure, which is the book that I really hated of Sophie Mackintosh's, I think that this book is not as viscerally disgusting in the way it treats the women in the book, but I do think that The Water Cure was a far more compelling story. The Water Cure, really quickly, is this story about these 3 young women who were raised isolated on an island completely separate from society by this very abusive mother and father pair, and the father is kind of like the patriarch, cult leader type figure, and he raises them to be very afraid of men. And then he goes off in his boat to get some supplies, and he never comes back, but 3 men wash ashore, and it's kind of just an exploration of the dynamics there. There's a really gross love story and this ambiguous age thing that I really hated and felt really grossed out by, and I thought that its framing as a feminist dystopian novel was fucking ridiculous. I'm sure I've already said that. I'm angry about it, and I will be until the day I die. But even saying that, it was a more interesting story than this was. I think that all of Sophie Mackintosh's books, or the 2 that I've read, I don't know if I can generalize, I think she's only written 3, they seem to be about naive women who are dependent on controlling, manipulative, charismatic men who take advantage of them. That was true of this book too. It just wasn't framed as feminist, except on the storygraph summary, and I think that if I had read that this was a feminist book on this, I would have been not quite as mad as The Water Cure, but pretty angry. I don't think Sophie Mackintosh is a bad writer. I think that her sentences are very well put together. I think her writing can be very evocative. It was more so in The Water Cure than it was in this. I think that she does have a beautiful style of prose. And I think my problems with her are not about her and more about the way her books are framed, which I recognize is not her fault or really her problem. That's the publisher. It does not change how I felt about The Water Cure or how I feel reading this with the idea that someone is trying to sell it as like a feminist piece of literature. It makes me feel like we are dampening what feminism actually means, and we're just calling things feminist because either they're written by women or they have women as leads. It doesn't track, it doesn't make any fucking sense, and I think it's ridiculous and stupid. I do think this book is better than The Water Cure, but also worse in some ways. So what's my conclusion on this? I don't know. Sophie Mackintosh, you're fine. I'm sorry that I judged you because of the way your publisher decided to try to sell your first novel. That's on me, but also mostly that's on your publisher. Have a chat with them. I am now reading Your Fathers, Where Are They? And The Prophets, Do They Live Forever? By Dave Eggers. If you can't tell by the title, Dave Eggers thinks he's a really witty guy, and he's not as witty as he thinks he is. but I will say I'm enjoying this a lot more than I expected to. I'll just like really quickly tell you the plot in this so far. I haven't finished it, so I'll finish it up later. I've got a new light in here, so I can finally film once the sun has gone down, so I might even talk to you again today. That's crazy. I usually can only film for 3 hours of the day because the lights in here are so orange, it makes me bright red on camera. So this book is following Thomas and the people that he kidnaps and brings to an abandoned military base. This is told entirely through conversations. It's just back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. There's no, like, narrative or descriptions or anything like that. It's just people speaking to each other. So each chapter is set in a different building on this military base with a different person that Thomas has kidnapped. It starts with Thomas having kidnapped Kev, who is an astronaut that he met when he was in his undergrad. Kev was TAing a class that he was taking. And this is kind of another obsession story because Thomas had become obsessed with Kev because Kev said he was going to be an astronaut and then he did end up being an astronaut. Thomas has like a really, really strange worldview that I will get into later, but he wants to know something from Kev. We're not sure what yet. It starts with him, a lot of back and forth with Thomas saying like, do you remember me? Do you remember me? He has this like overinflated sense of familiarity with Kev. He obviously was not an important moment in Kev's life, but Kev was very important to him. They end up getting into a conversation about how Kev's plan was to go on the shuttle, and then the shuttle is shut down like 6 months after he joins NASA, and Thomas feels like broken about this. This has really affected him because he thinks that it's not fair and he has a really strong sense of justice. And over the course of this first conversation with the two of them, Thomas becomes increasingly agitated about budget cuts to the space program. So he says to Kev, I'm sorry, I'll be back in like 7 hours. There's somebody else I gotta get and bring here. This first chapter, you have no inclination that he's going to kidnap more people, and then he just keeps doing it. The second person he brings is a retired congressman, and he's trying to like probe this guy to tell him more about why the space program had these budget cuts. They end up getting more into a conversation about like disillusioned young men like Thomas, and talking about how Thomas thinks that the government should be doing something, like giving some task to young men like him. Like he's comparing his situation with this former congressman who was sent to war in Vietnam. Thomas is saying like, I needed something like that, and I know there's many young men like me out there who need some sort of purpose. Okay, I'm so sorry my neighbor is so loud with his leaf blower, but I'm not gonna stop. You're just gonna have to deal with it. The link here is kind of tenuous, and I'm not 100% sure how we get here, but Thomas ends up saying, I gotta go get somebody else, and he kidnaps his former 6th grade teacher, and this teacher had retired because of multiple accusations against him from I think 7 young boys. And Thomas is talking about all of his memories with this teacher, which came very close to outright abuse, but never quite crossed that line. And the teacher is very like rehearsed and so like disgusting and sinister with the way he's talking about this. He's saying like, I did inappropriate things. It was inappropriate to invite boys to my house for a sleepover. It was inappropriate to play these games with you, but like I never touched you and I never made you touch me. He's clearly like justified it to himself and knows how to defend himself against this, because he did lose his job because of these accusations, but also was never convicted of anything. It's such a frustrating but also really compelling conversation between the two of them, getting these insights into how this man sort of like sees his own humanity and like is able to live with himself through this, just in the way that he's justifying what he's done. And it starts out with like outright denial of everything, and then we learn little bits and pieces that he admits to, and it gets kind of like more and more disturbing and horrific. We learn that every year this man would make a list of students that he felt like did not have great home lives, because those were the perfect students to invite back to his house for sleepovers where he could victimize them, but not all the way. It's so gross. And learning that he had been placed on this list of a kid with a broken home life compels him to bring his mom as the next person in one of these buildings. So he kidnaps her, and they just kind of have a confrontation about their lives together. His mom has struggled with addiction and has not been a good parent to him, and she talks about how he has always had something a little bit wrong with him. We get a little bit more insight into Thomas's life and like where he comes from. All the other ones have been more about his worldview. Like his mom tells a story about him not wanting to leave a friend's house, and she's trying to get him out of there, and he chokes her, and how she was so
frightened of him, even though he was only like 7. It seems like neither of them are people who can accept blame for anything. She wants to shove it all onto him and says, like, you were like this, not because of me. You would have turned out like this no matter who your parents were. If you had a mom who was present, if you had a mom who was sober, you still would have ended up like this. And he wants to blame everything on her. There's this other thread happening in the book that we learn a little bit more about each chapter, and that is with Thomas's best friend, Dawn. In the first chapter, we learn that Dawn is dead. He tells this to Kev because Kev accidentally calls him Dawn. They were always together in undergrad. They've been friends for their entire lives. When he's talking to the congressman about like disillusioned young men, he talks a little bit about Dawn and how he really struggled, that something had happened to him and that he had gone in and out of rehab and been to prison. And we also learned that he died by gunshot in his backyard. Then when it gets to the teacher, we learn that Dawn was one of the main victims of this teacher. He was one of the children who filed a complaint against him and was victimized to a greater extent than Thomas was. The teacher had like babysat him quite a few times. That's where I've got to now. I'm finding this really easy to read and really like fast-paced and compelling. I think that it like captures you right from the first sentence, and I'm excited to read more, and I'll see you when I have. Hello, I've spent the last couple of hours reading this and I've finished it. I'm going to tell you the rest of what happens in it. I surprisingly enjoyed this book, but I'll get into it later. So last time we talked, he had just kidnapped his mom, and after kidnapping his mom, he goes down to the beach, which is near this abandoned military base that he's at, and he sees a woman there, and he's like, oh my god, this is the woman of my dreams, like my literal dreams. I've had dreams of her for the past like 10, 20 years. This was meant to be. And seeing her convinces him that this is like some divine power is working in his favor, is the reason why he hasn't been caught and why kidnapping everyone has been so easy. It plants the seed in his head that he's invincible. He goes to talk to Kev about seeing this woman and saying like, oh my god, like I didn't talk to her, but I wish I had. And Kev is trying to get out of here, so he's telling him, you should go talk to her. Like, you gotta go do this. She was walking her dog, and Kev says, she's probably walking her dog twice a day. I'm sure she'll be back like later in the afternoon. In this conversation, Thomas also brings up the fact that he's been thinking that he wants to kidnap a cop as the next person. And Kev's like, you gotta do it. You haven't been caught this far. You're not gonna get caught getting the cop. Like, it'll be fine. So he does. He goes and grabs a cop off the street. It all goes fine. He brings the cop back to a different building in the military base, whatever it is. After successfully kidnapping this cop, he really starts to believe that he is invincible. He's literally kidnapped a cop. And he has this conversation with the cop. He's wanting to know things about policing because of the way that his friend Dawn died. We learn that this cop was there on that night that Dawn died. It is a pretty small town, but it is a little bit ridiculous how many people he can get that are like kind of connected to this death of his friend. And despite it being a small town, the suspension of disbelief was a little bit tricky here with the coincidence that the cop that he kidnapped would be a man who was involved in the death of his friend years before. I guess you could say that this is kind of the climax of the novel. We go through the entire series of events that led to Dawn's death, and the police officer was involved in every step. It starts with Dawn like standing on tables at a Denny's. He's having a psychotic episode, and the whole thing ends with him locking himself in his mom's basement. There's some really strong commentary here about policing and deadly force. This was a 5'7", 150-pound man holding like a kitchen knife, like a small steak knife. It didn't seem like this deadly force was necessary, and it shows how the cop has been trained to push the blame off of himself here. And it really goes into like the ridiculous overkill of policing, how this one small man who was really only a danger to himself had 14 cops pointing guns at him in his backyard and ended up dying. And the police officer here says that he was shot 3 times, that 3 officers shot and they each hit him, and that's what killed him. But we learn in the next chapter that that's not true. Because after talking with this cop, Thomas goes to the hospital where Dawn was taken after he was shot, and he kidnaps an administrator from that hospital. She was there on the night Dawn was sent there when he died, which is, again, like, a little silly. Like, you're telling me all these coincidences are really gonna happen? I don't know. This woman is definitely just a cog in a larger system that failed Dawn, and it's hard for Thomas not to blame her and only her. She was the final person who denied Dawn's mom access to him as he was dying, and also denied Thomas access. Dawn died on his own in the hospital. She also helped falsify the report because Dawn was actually shot 17 times, not 3. The entire book is social commentary. There's some more social commentary here about race and policing, because the police took advantage of Dawn's mom because she wasn't able to write in English. So they had him cremated before she could get an independent autopsy done. And this woman, this administrator from the hospital, also helped like push that through. I completely forgot to say that after the conversation with the cop, Thomas goes back down to that beach and he sees the woman again walking her dog, and he has a conversation with her this time, and he feels this spark. He's on cloud 9. He's walking on air. He's so thrilled because he thinks that they are going to fall in love and end up together. And she mentions to him that she'll be there the next morning walking her dog. And he absolutely takes that as like a plea for him to come and talk to her again, which he does after this conversation with the hospital administrator. And he goes to talk to her, and he has absolutely misread the situation. Of course, he's talked to this woman for like a couple of minutes, and he grabs her hand and like looks into her eyes, and she flinches, and so he chloroforms and kidnaps her just like everybody else. And in the ensuing conversation with her, the helicopters are closing in the background. He has been found. Throughout this conversation, he's trying to convince her to run away with him. He's telling her that they're going to fall in love, that this is the act of some divine force, and they were meant to be together. And she's really pushing back against him. He absolutely sees her as an object, and she knows that. Though this conversation is not very long, and she is one of 2 women in this whole story, I think she does have a very strong and well-developed personality that I enjoyed reading about and reading. Like, everybody in this pushes back against Thomas and tells him he's crazy. I really liked the way she did it in ways that I don't know how to explain. The book ends with Thomas and the congressman having another conversation as the SWAT team closes in on him. The congressman is the only person here who has really developed a sense of empathy for Thomas, and he actually really wants Thomas to get out of this alive, and he knows that he probably won't. He has been sitting here for days coming up with a plan for Thomas to get out of this situation, but Thomas doesn't take it. And the book kind of ends with Thomas being like, wow, this sucks. The world sucks. Life sucks. This is the worst. Though I wouldn't say it's an unsatisfying ending, even though it does kind of sound like it. I enjoyed this book a lot more than I thought I was going to. I think that it is gimmicky. Absolutely, it's gimmicky. Like I've told you, it's entirely conversations. I'm so sorry. I'm sure the book is making a really loud noise right now. I don't know if you can see that. It's entirely conversations. And that is hard to do. And I think Dave Eggers did it as well as he possibly could have done it, but that the book was still limited by its format and by like trying too hard to be something. Though I would also say overall, I think it did work. So I'm not really sure exactly how I feel about this choice to make it entirely dialogue. It was good in some ways and bad in other ways. It was surprisingly really easy to differentiate who was talking. Each voice is very clear in this story, which is great because I was really worried about that, because there is no indication other than like the text who's talking. It's just dash dialogue, dash dialogue, and it goes back and forth in a very structured way, but you can still get very lost in that. And I only found myself getting lost, I think one time I had to go back and like count up to the line where I was to see who it was that was talking. Other than that, it's very, very clear who is speaking and whose voice is whose, and that was super well done with this. The dynamics between the characters were very interesting, and I was very compelled by this the whole time. I never found it boring. I thought that Thomas's character was fascinating. He has this incredibly strict black and white worldview that he does not feel comfortable straying from. He has a strong belief almost in like maybe the American dream, but something simpler than that. That's just like there should be a formula through which you can achieve greatness. If you follow the steps, you should be able to become what you want to become. There's a strong sense of purposelessness and loneliness in Thomas's life that you can feel in everything that he does and everything that he says. He also sees himself as a victim of like a larger society and system and like world in general, even after committing all of these like ridiculously heinous crimes. One of the things that he has the most trouble with in life is that he doesn't feel like the world caters to him in the specific way that he wants it to. And he can be very frustrating to read, and even though he has this like very strong worldview and backwards ideas, you still do kind of feel a sense of empathy for him. And I think that's because it unfolds in a really kind of masterful way as you get to learn more about Thomas and his past and like why he's like this. I think I already said this, but similar to A Heartbreaking Work of Staggering Genius, Eggers thinks that he's wittier than he is, and sometimes it's a little bit cringe. It's not terrible in this book, though, and I think that's because it's not necessarily his voice. And sometimes I do like his dry sense of humor, and that's the same for A Heartbreaking Work of Staggering Genius. Also, similar to that memoir, the structure of these sentences is very well put together and very fun. I really like his word choice. Like, there's this one quote, "I don't think you're in danger of being confused with a man of delicacy or subtlety, son." Just like that. I just like the words that he chooses. They're
not over the top, but they are like delicious little words. If that makes sense. I think this was fun, and it was compelling, and it was a quick read, and it had things to say, and I enjoyed it thoroughly. I should not have written off Dave Eggers, though I do kind of still hold the same opinions about who he is as a person. I think he does fiction very well. Better than autobiography. Finally, I have some news to break to you. These are the last 2 books of the video, and I don't want to read Swamplandia, so I'm not going to. I think objectively, this will 100% be a better book than this. I'm just not all that interested in reading it, and I don't want to force myself to do it just for the video. This is going to be awful, and it's going to be a romp. It's going to be so fun to talk about how shitty this book is. And imagine I say all this and then it's great. No matter what happens with it, it's going to be awesome. So I will see you when I'm somewhere within Killing It by Mike Bockoven. I am here to talk to you about the worst book I have ever read in my life, and possibly one of the worst books that has ever been published, and that was Killing It by Mike Bockoven. This was somehow worse than his first book, Fantastic Land, which used to hold the title of the worst book I had ever read. I have so much that I need to get off my chest about this book. I need to complain and I need to rant, but first I'm going to tell you what happens in this. It begins in like the 1980s, 1990s with this man named Jaff who buys an old bodega to turn into a stand-up comedy club because he loves stand-up. That's his passion. While he's renovating this bodega, a teenager comes in and he's like harrowed looking, and he tells the man that he shouldn't have bought this club, that he didn't do enough research, and that if she tells him to do something, don't listen to her. And he's like, what are you talking about? And the kid's like, just don't listen to her. And then he like runs out, and it's very dramatic. And then chapter 2 begins 20 years after this buying of the club and this incident with the teenager. The club has somewhat made a name for itself. It's not like in the upper echelons of New York stand-up comedy clubs, if that even really exists. Who likes stand-up comedy this much? But it is keeping itself afloat. This night is the entire rest of the novel, and it begins with Jaff, the club owner, who has this brutal headache that makes him violent towards women, particularly his common-law wife, Callista. They've been fighting a lot. He's had this brutal headache for a couple of days, and they're fighting right now because he wanted to have sex and she said no. So he's really, really pissed at her. He calls her the C word, and then he's like, damn. That's not like me. That's crazy that I did that. And she's like, I'm breaking up with you. And he's like, really? Are you? And then he hits her over the head with a printer, like bashes her fucking head in, kills her, takes her down to the closet in the basement, and he's like, I gotta open up in half an hour. I don't even think it's half an hour. It might be just like literally 5 minutes. I don't know how there's not blood everywhere because he has like brutally beaten this woman, but he just kind of stows her body, and then the club is fine to open for the night. This is the first of many plot holes that you will find in this story. We're now introduced to the comics, which include Brayden, who is the MC, he's younger, Taylor, who was supposed to do a set that night but got booted off by one of the older, more well-established comics. Jackie, who is like a stereotypical loud New Yorker, she's another older comic. There's Jared, who is also an older comic, and Jared is there. He's the one who bumped Taylor. He's there trying to suck up to the other comic, Sammy, because Jared wants to get a show on Comedy Central, and Sammy has a lot of power with like TV networks. And then there's also Terry Stafford, who is the most famous and well-known of all of these comics, shouldn't even really be playing a show at this kind of lower down comedy club, but has recently been canceled because he sexually assaults many women over a long period of his career. It's kind of just like a rumor that Terry is going to show up, and everybody's really tense about it. There's very little plot in this book, so we get a lot of introduction chapters. Jackie's introduction chapter kind of also introduces you to the way that Mike Bockoven writes women, which is not in a hateful way and is definitely in a way where he's trying to be progressive, but he just can't do it very well. Her chapter is all about an experience she had where Terry assaulted her, whereas all of the men get to be someone other than just like something that has happened to them or a man in their life. She's very much reduced. Leading up to the show, Jaff is being a total asshole. He's usually a grump and everybody knows him as kind of a dick, but not like this. He slaps Brayden on the back of the head and says, you gotta go up and do a mic check. He overhears Sammy call the club a shithole and he smashes a glass in his hand. Then at the end of the night, after all the sets are finished, where Sammy has been bumped in favor of Terry, the predator, to do this like last hurrah set in front of everybody. Jaff tells everyone in the club to go home, which is very abnormal. Typically people would stay and he'd make a lot of money selling them drinks. And he also tells Brayden to go down into the green room downstairs and tell all of the comics that they're not getting paid that night. Downstairs in this basement green room, all of the comics are there just kind of hanging out. They all sort of have ulterior motives, talking to each other and like trying to get ins with each other, and none of it really matters, and I don't care to tell you about it because this book is so fucking stupid. Who cares what Mike Bockoven was trying to do with his characters here, because he did nothing. They're down in the green room when they hear this dragging noise, and it's Callista, his wife, who has survived, made her way out of this broom cleaning closet that she had been trapped in, and is brutally beaten on the brink of death, begging them for help. Brayden runs up the stairs and tells Jaff that he has to call the cops, and then runs back down, and when Jaff finally comes to meet them, he's looking at Callista with this disgust on his face, and it's very clear, no matter how much he tries and fails to hide it, that he was responsible for this and that the cops aren't coming. And when they start pushing back against him, he takes out a gun and he shoots Brayden in the stomach, and he locks them all down there in the green room. Upstairs, Terry is in Jaff's office because obviously he was not going to have a good time with all these comics who hate him. And Terry sees Jaff pretending to call the police and knows what he's doing, so he calls the police, and Jaff then beats the fuck out of Terry. Jaff is being driven by this woman's voice in his head and also by the pain in his head, and downstairs, Sammy is also starting to hear that voice but is better able to ignore it. Downstairs, the comics bust a hole through the door, and they manage to get a small hole because it's like thin wood on either side of the door, but there's like structural wood inside that they cannot move apart. So it's just this very small hole in between this structural wood. And only Taylor, who is like a very, very small, petite woman, can fit through this hole. So she does. And as soon as Taylor escapes into this hallway, Jaff is making Terry come downstairs because he wants Terry to control the comics, because Jaff's main goal is to finish off his wife and then kill himself. Terry goes down first and he sees that Taylor has escaped, so he tries to distract Jaff, who ends up shooting Terry's dick off. Taylor has managed to slip by Jaff without him noticing her and into the broom closet where Callista was hidden, but when she tries to come out when she knows Jaff is distracted by the other comics, she hits Terry with the door and screams, and then he notices her. And while he lunges for her, Terry from the ground pulls a knife out of his pocket and stabs Jaff in like the calf, which slows him down, and Taylor manages to run upstairs and gets her phone and calls the police. Downstairs, Jaff finishes Terry off and then comes upstairs and shoots Taylor's hand that's holding the phone. Then back downstairs, all of the comics in the green room are suddenly now able to make a hole big enough to escape out of from the door. It is not explained why only Taylor could fit through before and now they can just bang a hole out. It makes no fucking sense. Back upstairs, when Jaff tries to finish Taylor off, he realizes that he is out of bullets in his small little 6-chamber gun. So he instead goes to the kitchen to go get a knife. At this point, Jared and Sammy are coming up the stairs, but Sammy gets scared and runs away. This is a theme that Sammy is a coward. But Jared comes up and he yells to Taylor, who says that she called the cops. At this point, he calls her a good girl and baby for absolutely no reason. It is not played as weird. It's like supposed to be endearing. She's quite a bit younger than him. It was really fucking uncomfortable. Jared tries to take Jaff down with like a chair leg, but he loses to the knife that he's grabbed very quickly and is beaten to death and pushed down the stairs. Jaff then sends Taylor down the stairs, but he doesn't kill her, saying that he just needs time to clean up the place before the cops get there. And he's somehow praying that they'll all just stay quiet when the police show up and he'll just get away with it. Sammy is too cowardly to go back up, so Taylor and Jackie, who has been trying to help Callista, who's really like about to die, decide to go up in this like hashtag girl power moment. All of a sudden, once they leave the green room, Taylor is like, I have the gun. I have his gun, which is like played as this big moment. It's like the end of a chapter, but she knows that his gun is unloaded, so I'm not sure. It seems like they're planning on using it against Jaff, because she pulls out the gun when she's saying like, what are we gonna do to take him down? They end up making Molotov cocktails out of cleaning supplies in the closet. And after they make these Molotov cocktails, Sammy comes out and he's like, what about me? What's gonna happen to me? So Taylor throws him the gun and just like passes it off onto him. Then they hear voices talking upstairs and they know that the police are here. Upstairs, a policeman has shown up, just one of them, and he thinks things are weird. He has this police intuition and he notices like a huge blood stain on the ground. Jaff has dimmed the light, so he says, oh, let me go turn the lights on so we can go and look at it. And when he goes to turn the lights on, he also turns music on
full blast, like you cannot hear anything. And when the music comes on, Taylor and Jackie come running up the stairs with their Molotov cocktails, and the police officer is distracted by them and doesn't notice Jaff coming towards him with a knife. Then we go back downstairs where Callista succumbs to her injuries in the green room. Then we come back upstairs where the cop is fighting with Jaff, trying to shoot at him but missing, and then Sammy comes running up the stairs with the empty gun, and the police officer sees this guy running towards him, can't hear anything over the music, and shoots Sammy, who falls back down the stairs. Then the lights go out and a bunch of stuff happens, but nothing happens. It's just them kind of like groping around in the dark, trying to find each other. There's some knife wounds, like it's him just padding out this book that, again, has very little actual plot. The lights go back on, and Jaff is behind the police officer and cuts his throat and grabs his gun. And then Sammy appears from downstairs, having just taken a gunshot to the shoulder with one of the women's Molotov cocktails, which he throws at Jaff and sets him on fire. Finally, at this point, they have a clear path to the exit. Now, the exits have been a little bit confusing because he did not plan this book. This was a published first draft. At first, he says that there's 3 exits: the front door, which he's locked, the door by the kitchen, and the door from his office. At this point in the book, they're also talking about a door behind the stage, and it seems now that there's not a door at his office. For some reason, they don't escape through the front door, which has obviously been unlocked to let the police officer through. It makes no sense, but it doesn't have to make sense because this is Mike Bockoven's world, and he's an idiot. Taylor has a clear shot at the door, so she runs for it. It's not locked, there's nothing blocking it, but there's some ghostly voice in her head that is keeping her from being able to push the door all the way open. And what she does, and what is kind of a thing that happens a few times in this book, is she fights back with comedy. One of the worst, hardest to read scenes I have ever encountered in my life because it was just that bad. It was horrible. Oh my god, it was so stupid. Taylor's now on the street running to find help while Jaff turns to Sammy and kills him with his knife. Then he goes for Jackie and they get into a knife fight. Jackie ends up winning, but just barely. She's super injured, but Jaff is now dead. Taylor and Jackie and Brayden, who had that gunshot wound to the stomach, they all survive, and they come out better for it. Taylor loses her arm, Jackie loses her eye. It's a long road to recovery, but they get, like, deals with HBO to talk about their story. They can book any club that they want to anywhere in the country. I don't know, they're like celebrities for it. At the end, a retired detective visits Taylor to tell her about the murder that had happened in the same building in 1986 that kid from the beginning was obviously warning Jaff about. And he shows her this long history of this building and how there had been many murders that had happened there. It's a ghost story. It's a stupid fucking ghost story. He also shows her a photo of the crime scene where they had found behind a wall this old sign from the original bar in like the 1800s that said, "No one leaves," which is like the thing the voice was saying to everyone the entire time that they were there. The end of the book, very end, is an epilogue where a new person has bought this building and is renovating it, and then Jackie comes and warns him about what happens in this building. That's it. That's the story. It sounds bad just from there, but it gets so much worse. This book, like I already said, was a published first draft. There was no editor here whatsoever, and I'm not convinced that Mike Bockoven can spell or read. I have made a list, and I'm just going to go through rapid fire of all of the spelling and grammar mistakes that were glaringly obvious in this. Not even talking about the amount of times tense didn't match within a sentence, which was all the fucking time, or just the things that editors should have caught, like him constantly using a word twice in the same sentence. Here we go. I really need to get this off my chest, so I'm just going to try to get it over with as fast as possible. Page 5. He was the second of third, not or third. His name is literally misspelt at the top of every page in this book. They spell it with an A instead of an E. Page 24, called is girlfriend, not his girlfriend. Page 25, to party, not to a party. Page 64, 2 periods, and it's clearly not supposed to be an ellipses. Page 72, it says awkwardly. Page 80, it spelled Snoop Dogg wrong, which felt kind of disrespectful. Page 92, missing a quotation mark. Page 100, it says, in quotes, did he just lock us in, comma, Sammy asked, question mark. Page 102, shotgun, not 2 words. Page 107, Terry sold instead of Terry said. Page 117, to avoid having actually do anything. Page 121, uses the masculine form of petite to describe Taylor, a woman, again on page 122. Page 126, his element, 1 word. Page 126 again, he was already of the cliff, supposed to be on the cliff. Page 128, Jaff raised, 1 word. Page 130, period,
lowercase and, if you go to jail, period. Obviously meant to be commas. Page 131, aneurysm is spelled wrong. Page 131 is equilibrium, not his equilibrium. Page 137, whiny is spelled in 2 different ways in 2 sentences. Page 164, much to is 1 word. Page 165, finish, comma, then a dash for no reason, just added in randomly. Page 168, out of the corner of his eye, period instead of a comma, through the tiny hole. Page 172, he refers to Jaff as Terry. Terry has been dead for like 50 pages at this point. Page 172, the end randomly has a line break before the last line. Page 173, Brayden could tell they, she, was. Not a woke moment. This was just him putting in 2 pronouns for no reason. Page 174, missing period. Page 192, Van could, supposed to be that could. Page 200, hurled at your all at once. I don't even know what that's supposed to say. Page 208, improvise instead of improvised. Page 218, sending coasters flying get instead of out. Page 227 says Jackie's lying on the floor by the bar, but it's actually Taylor. Page 228, streetlight shone with a W, not the proper way that word is spelled. Page 235, of is jaw, again supposed to be of his jaw. Page 239, began danced up the rag instead of began dancing up the rag. Page 240, death throws, spelled with a W. Page 243, it says cloths instead of clothes. Page 249, she tired a different tactic. Page 264, until here was nothing left. Page 270, he calls him Terry Richardson when his name has been Terry Stafford the entire time. Page 275, it starts a sentence with between that, all lowercase. The B has just been erased. Page 276, it spells below with an I. Page 277, no matter how hard she tired. Page 279, a sentence starts with ma'am and it's uncapitalized. Page 284, poplar instead of popular. Page 287, starting off in the middle distance, staring off in the middle distance. Page 291, hallowed instead of hollowed. This was traditionally published. Never in my entire life have I read a book with this many mistakes. And like, if I read a book with 2 mistakes like this, I think, wow, this was poorly edited. This was beyond anything I've ever experienced. It was absolutely bonkers. There are so many continuity errors. Terry's accusations were said to be a few days ago, and then all of a sudden they were that same day. Sammy has written a book with 7 steps to success that now has 9 steps to success, and Jaff is said to be 5'11", and then he's said to be 5'9". Unfortunately, he did try to write a black character. Jared is black, and it's not like outright insanely offensive, but it is a very stereotypical like black voice that is clearly written by a white man from Nebraska. Like the overuse of the word ain't, or like smoking weed being a core part of his personality. It's so fucking icky. It's also icky the way that Mike Bockoven writes women, which I've already kind of touched on. Jackie is played as like a strong woman until she becomes like whimpery and maternal at the first sight of danger, and she goes back to strong. It's really weird, and like he makes her seem so motherly as soon as like bad things start happening, when that was not her character beforehand. The plot here is also cut up with little bits of stand-up segments from each of the comics, and the women's stand-up segments are entirely about sex and men, whereas the men's are not at all. It's also kind of interesting how he decided to write this book with stand-up segments about comedians when he's not funny. I feel really terrible about every other book that I have ever said is not a good book or that I've disliked, because this makes them all seem like genius classics. This is so fucking horrible. I cannot think of one good thing to say about it. Everything else I read here, I've come to the conclusion of like, yeah, maybe I have judged these authors a little bit too much. Him, not enough. Not enough. I could not possibly judge him with the judgment that he deserves. He is terrible. It's offensive. It is offensive that someone was able to publish not only 1, but 2 books of this horrific quality when there are so many good, like honestly, I think probably most fan fiction out there is better written than this is. It's a scourge on society. It's horrible. His name is spelled wrong at the top of every page. I was like 20 pages into this and I'm like, wow, this is really poorly edited, like crazy. It really feels like there was never a second read through. He just wrote it and then sent it off and they published it. And I'm thinking like, okay, sometimes the editor is put on like the publication page. So I go to look and I see the street name of the publisher and I see that it says 62 Ottawa Road. And Ottawa, it's in New Jersey, but I know because I'm Canadian and that's my capital city. That's probably not how Ottawa is spelled, but I think this is a New Jersey street. Maybe it's different. I look it up. No, they've spelled their own address wrong. Okay, I have to forget about it. I have to just leave it. I'm going to close this video off. I'm going to say Ocean Vuong. I still don't get it, but I want to, and I'm committed to. I'm going to read Night Sky with Exit Wounds, and I'm going to love it. I promise. Sophie Mackintosh, it was not your fault that I hated the water cure so fucking much. This was okay. It could have been better, but it could have been a lot worse. And I did end up enjoying it, I think. Dave Eggers, you are a good fiction writer. I hate to say it. I can't excuse the fucking racism of a heartbreaking work of staggering genius and the egocentrism and just like your terrible personality. This was a really good book and I'm still thinking about it. Mike Bockoven, you deserve to be put to death. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.